without further ado, how social insights are preparing brands for an unconventional summer. So first things first, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Menaka is a digital and social media expert with 2 decades of experience in online communities, social media, and brand strategy. At Ipsos, Menaka leads the social media exchange practice with an emphasis on innovative applications and strategic best practices for using communities and social intelligence to affect business growth. Vijay leads a team of solutions engineers who provide expert technical consulting and scoping. Vijay has more than a decade of experience working in social media and digital marketing, both on the service side and as a customer. And me, I'm Anna. I am a content marketing associate here at Synthesio, and I'll just be emceeing, guiding you guys through the webinar. So just a few quick housekeeping topics before we dive into the data. This webinar will run for 1 hour, and we will send the recording and the slides via email after the presentation. If you have questions, please message them in the chat. You'll see the questions chat in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will answer them at the end during the Q&A session. For any questions after the webinar, please reach out directly to your dedicated contact at Synthesio or Ipsos. And I do ask, please, if you share anything on social media during the webinar, if you could use the hashtag SynthesiaLive. And that's about it. Now I'd love to hand it over to Vijay to kick it off.
Thanks, Anna. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just wanted to thank everyone for joining in these uncertain times. And I know we've all seen those ads, and that's a big part of why we're here. Things are changing, and we're trying to understand as summer approaches if the way the consumers are behaving is different in the with COVID, with the protests that are happening right now. Are the traditional approaches to reach and understand our customers and the public, are they working? And it's an unconventional summer, and by that we mean the typical summer, conventional summer, weddings, summer vacation, travel. In the US, there's baseball, there's sports everywhere, barbecue, summer camps, going beach, et cetera, all of these things that involve really social activities, being with other people. And of course, the current context is very much about social distancing. And so when we're asking, can we understand, what can we expect with an unconventional summer? One of the things I want to do before we get into some of our findings is take a step back and just make sure that define the how we get to some of these findings. Take a few minutes and then we'll jump into some of these things. But when we're talking about an unconventional summer, we're talking about things like, how do people deal with travel? What are they doing for vacations or so-called vacations? Entertaining kids during summer vacation from school. How are they handling health? That's a big part of health, and wellness is a big part of summer experience. And really ultimately, the question is, now that we're in this kind of context, it seems like really we're part of a new abnormal, and that's really where we are. So before getting into the findings, you can't give good answers without having good questions. So we wanted to start with what our clients were telling us or asking us really, and the things that we saw coming up from what they were saying. And these are the anxieties that they were sharing with us, how to adjust business strategies, what do we do with the second wave, which marketing activities do we focus on, how do we provide support? And obviously we can't necessarily answer all these questions, and there are business specific variables at play, but we could definitely clarify them and make more sense of them to start unpacking the new normal based on what the consumers are telling us. And of course, there's another whole context, when we scheduled this webinar, we were thinking about coronavirus, but now obviously there's these protests happening worldwide, and that's another set of anxieties that we're seeing our customers asking about as well. But when we think about that, that means taking into context the anxieties and the fact that the consumers and consumer behavior necessarily has to change in the context of coronavirus. Um, we need to figure out how to understand them. And obviously social intelligence is important, but what that means is taking social data and using it intelligently to transform it into useful insight. And this will serve as a backdrop in terms of everything we do. All the findings we give you are the backdrop is we're taking that data and using it intelligently to make sense of it and understand the people who are talking. So when we're talking about social data, it's useful to kind of set some context and set some parameters here. So the first thing is why it matters. Now, we know for a fact that the pandemic and the protests are causing drastic changes in the way consumers are behaving, right? Formerly, we could count on word of mouth to be a big part of, going into the office. Oh, I've got these new Apple AirPods. Oh, what do you like them, etc. And now everything is exclusively online. And so understanding the consumers and really centering our focus on what the consumers and the public generally wants is critical. And luckily, we have that through the social web and through the data that we find online. And this is right now, this is not like something that is optional, because to understand our consumers, we have one live dynamic window into how their lifestyles are changing. Um, and how social intelligence can help you, because you can actually start uncovering things. So what we've done at Ipsos is we've actually been doing a lot of research on things that are evolving in the consumer behavior, specifically in the last few months. And what has come up is a crisis of confidence, and it points to an interesting reshaping of consumer habits and preferences. So what we have here is actually a few dimensions that we've found are critical for brands to stay close to their customers. And the reason, again, I'm talking about this is without a good approach to understanding that social data, um, we can prepare for an unconventional summer with the wrong point of view and get the wrong insight. So good questions lead to good insights. And one of the things we found here with this framework is that customers are seeking that belonging, that certainty, fair treatment, joy, etc. And these point to a focus on the customer experience and the relationship between the brand and the customer that go beyond just the brand. It goes into everything that a person is doing right now. And if you think about this in the context of even the protests recently, lots of brands blacked out their Instagram handles and started talking about things in the talking about Black Lives Matter and how they support it. And that would be something like establishing that they're part of the community, establishing that they have the same status, belonging in the community. That's what the brands were doing. And of course, what the customers were responding to, we saw a lot of this, is saying, okay, but what are you doing? Are you putting your money where your mouth is? Are you actually providing that fair treatment? Are you actually ceding control to people of color? So what we can see is these key dimensions for fostering these close relationships actually help us understand how the customer is thinking beyond everything. So then circling back to us as brands, one of the key things that we've observed in our customers is that there have been two approaches, roughly two approaches, ineffective and effective, related to responding to essentially the status quo being thrown out. The first is pretty ineffective. It's very brand focused. It's from the perspective of I am brand and I want to know how customer relates to me, when they talk about me, when they talk to me, and then when they talk about or to my competitors. And it's very much putting the brand at the center of the relationship. It also is very focused on that tactical right now perspective, and using the traditional social inputs like Twitter. Ultimately, it's really narrow, and it doesn't capture the full set of, all these business anxieties of these customers that we have are mirrored by anxieties that our customers have. And so we need to actually reflect that in the way we approach it. So the effective listening is empathetic. It's looking at things from the customer perspective, and it's also looking at the change in customer behavior, regardless of brand. Again, when I'm going out for a drive because a lockdown has been lifted, I'm not talking about getting into my specific model of car or even make of car. I'm talking about the experience of driving. And so thinking about it like a consumer. Now, some of these things are things that we at Ipsos and Synthesio have been saying for years, but constraints by the status quo made it sometimes hard for us to move beyond it. But COVID provides a little bit of an opportunity to let go of these bad habits and get a little bit more customer focused. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to be talking about the different lenses that come up from from how we look at the data. So for example, when we think about the way we parse data, humans are talking about their experiences. They're not talking at brands, as I said. And there's a lot of data out there. So we need to think about all the different ways we're looking at it. So the simple one is we have a brand tracker. We're already tracking it, understanding it. And we just want to overlay COVID as a lens. Simple filter, highlight how the brand is directly affected. If you're in travel, absolutely valuable. But in other contexts, your coffee brand might not be like, if you're buying coffee beans, might not be directly affected the same way, or maybe would be because people are at home and making their own coffee. You can use that simple lens. A little bit more complex, but not super complex, is using time as a lens. Looking at the same exact information that you already have and overlay the concept of time and zoom out and spread out and see what is changing in the shape of conversation over time. Now, none of this is rocket science, but it's useful to reiterate because this is what we're doing when we're looking at all of the data that we're seeing. And then the most advanced thing you can do, taking into account these other lenses, is lifestyle as a lens. So in terms of building a social data set, you're just looking at lifestyle conversations. You can overlay COVID, you could overlay time, you could overlay anything and really understand context. So basically, are we uncovering the real thoughts of consumers from what they want to tell us or what we want to hear? And that's the focus of what we want to do. We want to focus on what they're trying to tell us, regardless of what we want to hear. And with that in mind, I want to kind of be very current right now, and thinking about a context and a lens. Taking lifestyle as a lens, we have a data set, a social dashboard that is looking at lifestyle conversations. And instead of overlaying COVID, let's actually overlay protest. So this dashboard that we built is looking at several dimensions of lifestyle. There's work life, there's home and family life, school, people talking about social good, health and wellness. And these are things that we can monitor regardless of the context, right? We can monitor it in the best of times and worst of times. And when we overlay a simple question of how are people talking about protests, immediately something emerges. On the left, we see a peak related to this would be the reopen protest, the haircut protest, whatever you want to talk about it, however you want to refer to it. And those are all about looking forward, people trying to project their future out and talk about reopening, talking about their going forward in life. The more recent protests related to Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, you can see the thing that's trending is social good. And actually another one that is rising pretty fast is health and wellness. What we can see, looking at data that is pretty much context neutral, it's just about what people are talking about when they're talking about health and wellness or work life or so on and so forth, is we can see that the patterns of conversation change depending on the lens that we overlay on it. Related to that on the protests, another angle we could apply is looking at the general conversations about lifestyle and overlay specific things around, say, reopening on the left and the Black Lives Matters Black Lives Matter on the right. And again, we can see differences. The one on the left, even though it's talking about reopening, mentions the AR-15, mentions haircuts, etc. And then on the left, we're seeing, of course, Minneapolis. We're seeing protests, Black Lives Matter again. But there's a similar context underlaying all of this. And that's the thing that we can see emerging when we're looking at the data and applying multiple lenses. We can start to see additional patterns. The pandemic lives underneath a lot of this. And when we're looking at the data and when we're talking about this kinds of insights we're going to be seeing throughout the rest of this webinar and the kinds of findings we found about how consumers and the public is thinking about an unconventional summer. This is the approach we've been taking generally. On that note, I think this would be a good time to pass the baton over to you, Menaka. And yeah, there we go.
Sure, thanks, Vijay. All right, let me just jump in. So yeah, so Vijay set the stage really nicely, because I think one of the things that from an Ipsos perspective, when we're looking at how to analyze and understand the consumer experience, you do need to approach it from different lenses. I did see a question come through wanting to understand more about the framework that Vijay shared. That actually comes from a recent POV from our customer experience team at Ipsos. And the context of that framework is really about how do brands continue to stay top of mind and really think about the experience they're putting in front of consumers in the midst of a yes, thank you. In the midst of the pandemic, when there is more social distancing and things have moved into more of a digital format for many people. So that's where that's coming from, and we can definitely share the link to the POV as a follow-up as well. But going back to talking about the human experience, just to set the stage a bit for everyone, we have been looking at this from the context of the coronavirus pandemic in the US and globally at Ipsos since the beginning of the year, really. In the US, we've been really digging into, obviously Ipsos does a ton of polling data. We have a lot of survey-based information. But from my team's perspective, we're really focused on online communities and social intelligence. And what we've really been using these two data sources for, which are really social data, is to provide texture, provide understanding, and really lead to that empathy piece that Vijay mentioned. Because I think one of the most important things that we're seeing, and it's really what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter and the protests we're seeing around the country, is the coronavirus has absolutely exacerbated some of the things that have really been around for a while in terms of income inequality, healthcare issues. These things have always kind of been there, but in the midst of the pandemic, they've very much come to the forefront, and we're seeing a lot of that playing out right now. And understanding how people are experiencing that is really critical for brands today as they think about what they can do to be there to support people through this. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to set the stage a bit by talking through the Ipsos Pandemic Adaptability Continuum, or IPAC as we like to call it. So this is a strategic scenario planning framework that our advisory team Strategy 3 put together. The context of this framework is to help us understand and to help our clients and brands understand how things might play out. None of us have the crystal ball, but we do know what has been happening, what's happening globally, and we have some understanding of how the process of grief happens, WHO data on pandemics, and using all of those different kind of lenses, we can look at some of the different ways that people might be experiencing this. When we look at this in the context of the human experience, one thing is very clear. It is a very individual journey. Some people might still be in acclimation, others may be way beyond that into rebuilding. It depends on where we live. It depends on what our income level is. It depends on our race. It depends on what we have, like if we have kids or not. So there's a lot of different things that are driving this journey. So using social data can give us that context. So if we go to the next slide, for example, You can see on the slide, thank you, when we were looking early on at social conversation, we saw how the different phases that are in this continuum were coming through in conversation, particularly about food, right? At this point, you've probably seen a lot of these trends and heard a lot about a lot of these things, but early on, you know, as the pandemic was first starting to hit in the US, we saw a large uptick in conversation about how do we use food as an immunity booster. Then we saw the panic buying, the stockpiling really taking over the conversation. It moved in as people were getting more adjusted into quarantine snacking. And then as acclimation to cold and endurance came in, the nostalgia came through, right? We saw people buying more cereals and like trying to find like recipes they made with their grandmother, things that helped them feel safe. And then we saw that kind of the rise of the home chef as people were thinking about how do I get through this, right? There's economic implications. I need to save money. I want to cook from scratch more. There's a survivalist element there, or even just the piece of accomplishment and feeling like I have some sense of control by making my own sourdough bread, right? So those were the things we started to see. And you can see how the social conversation really helped to bring that to life. We also see that come through in the conversation with memes, right? I'm sure, I don't know if you're like me, but I love memes. And they have been incredibly insightful as you look at the experience people are going through in this continuum, right? We saw when, you know, like when people were just really hoping to get out of like quarantine, the feeling that Phil Collins has in that picture about, you know, when the drums kick in the air tonight. We're still seeing a lot of places talk about states reopening and not being quite sure about what that looks like. And I think more than anything, there is such a great amount of unknown. That is something that I think all of us can agree with. We don't really know what the future holds. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know if there will be a second wave later this year. There's still an uptick in cases around the country in certain parts. And I think a lot of us kind of feel like Kanye, where it's like, what's going to come next? So in thinking through that, we really are trying to understand what the lenses we can use to bring this story to life. So one of the, obviously the most straightforward lenses is to look at conversation about coronavirus, as Vijay mentioned. As you can see on this, the conversation about COVID has steadily declined week over week, and it continues to decline. And we're seeing that it's linked to a couple things, right? It's linked to there's just greater fatigue about talking about it. We're seeing that it's just kind of becoming part of our lives, right? It is what it is. We're seeing that, you know, the tendency of the conversation does seem to ladder to the daily news cycle. And even in recent weeks, we're seeing that the conversations about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests are definitely overtaking conversation about COVID. And again, that does ladder again to what we're seeing in the daily news cycle. The dips you're seeing week over week is very much linked to the weekend. So again, that links back to the point around laddering to the daily news cycle. But what does this tell us? It tells us a few things. It tells us that people are tired of talking about it. It tells us that this is kind of part of our life right now. So that in itself is an insight, right? If we go to the next slide, we dig into this conversation a bit more. We try to understand the emotions driving the conversation around COVID. And again, this also ladders to what we're seeing in the daily news cycle. We see that anger and annoyance is very much the dominant emotion versus things like optimism. And there are times when optimism spikes. There's times when depression and fear spike. And all of those things are things that we can double click into the data set to understand what's driving that. If you go to the next slide, we can also look at the same data set around COVID conversation and dig into it in the context of the topics being discussed within mentions of coronavirus. So in this context, you know, one thing that we've been seeing in recent weeks that's been really interesting is there's been a great uptick in conversation around preventative actions. And that is linked not only to conversations around the vaccine, but also around masks. And actually, I wanted to show this polling stat from Ipsos that when we dug into the social data brought that to life, right? We saw that 60% of Americans say they're maintaining social distance, 50% say they're wearing a mask all the time, but only 18% report they're seeing others wear masks or maintaining social distance when they go out. That's a conflict, right? As we dug into the social conversation, we saw that frustration come out. We saw the people wishing everyone was wearing masks. We saw the people saying, I don't want to wear masks. And we started to get more human understanding to what was driving that conflict. If you go to the next slide, even taking that conversation a step deeper, we can look at the subtopics below those higher level topics. And here you start to get more detail behind what is driving some of those shifts in conversations. So for example, early on, the conversation around coronavirus, while it still dominates the conversation, was very much about the case counts. How many cases, how many deaths, again, very linked to the news cycle. We're seeing in recent weeks that conversations about reopening. Clearly that's happening, so there's more conversation about that. We're seeing vaccine conversation being discussed more. We're seeing travel restrictions having an increase. And again, all of these are clues to showcase that there's something that people are getting anxious, right? I showed that continuum. They're trying to move into the rebuilding. They want, when does that rebuilding come into play? And all of these kind of details give us more understanding about the why behind that. If you go to the next slide. Interestingly, though, when we look at a different lens, we start to understand another element to the story. So when people are talking about coronavirus, it's not surprisingly the things that we would expect, right? They're talking about when's this going to end, reopening, wearing masks, vaccines. When we start to look at the conversation around lifestyle and how people are just living in the midst of this reality, we see a very different breakdown of the emotions coming through in the conversation. And you can see here that gratitude, just feeling grateful for what I have, trying to find some optimism, those things are really the dominant emotions coming through in the conversation. When we look at the why behind it, I think we're seeing this even more in the recent weeks, right? There is an uptick in anger, but the anger is coming from a place of wanting to drive change. And a lot of that, the we're in this together, which obviously has been trending since the beginning of the pandemic, we're seeing kind of how are people trying to find some kind of hope, some kind of joy, something that kind of keeps them going to see this through the end. So that all kind of plays into what does that mean for summer, right? That's what we're talking about today, right? So when we think about that, how are people trying to find that hope? One thing that we dug into is health and wellness. As Vijay mentioned, thinking about thinking about how people are looking at their fitness and all of those things come into play for summer, right? That's a big part of summer. And we saw during the quarantine, there were a lot of memes and conversations around just indulging and sitting on the couch and Netflix and chill and kind of feeling a little bad about that and just eating whatever I needed to eat to get through this. We saw in the conversation there was an uptick in terms of people talking more about getting in shape. You can see some of the things like I'm starting, trying, feeling, a lot of words that indicate kind of this move or shift to thinking about fitness. And that comes through in the top hashtags in the dashboard as well, where we see fitness, workout, motivation. And Vijay will actually show a bit more in the actual dashboard how that comes through in the data. The other piece that we kind of dug into in terms of what could we look forward to as we look at summer is really understanding how people are kind of finding ways to create celebrations, to connect with one another. We are a social being, right? We want to connect with one another. We want to find ways to maintain those connections, but obviously safety is a big part of that consideration now. We saw a huge uptick in conversation around the backyard, outdoor spaces. And, for those of us that are lucky enough to have outdoor spaces, people are getting very creative with how they're using them. And we see this in social data, we're seeing this in our community as well, where people are really talking about kind of creating experiences in their yards, creating different seating areas in their yards so they can have people come over and sit and have their own little cooler, and maybe doing like backyard camping, doing movie nights, but it's socially distanced. People are getting really creative with how they can create those opportunities to still have a celebratory summer, even in the context of trying to stay safe.
And one thing to add, I'm noticing just looking at this, there's also going back to those 6 dimensions. There's a bit of control, right, with the gardening, like taking control over something when you don't have control over the outside world.
Yeah, and that's a big piece of what we're seeing in a lot of the trends that have come through during this pandemic, even if it's like cooking, gardening, like redoing your closet. A lot of those things are like, what do I have control over to keep me kind of going through this and feeling safe? So if you go to the next slide. Another piece, obviously cooking has had a resurgence during the pandemic and the quarantine. A lot of people talking about cooking, and we saw, I showed you the food conversation early on, but we actually are seeing that cooking is continuing to maintain high levels of volume in the conversation. The conversation about it is shifting a bit, right? There's a lot of conversation that's linked to feelings of happiness. And actually, when we dug into that, it's twofold. There was happiness about not having to cook anymore because I can finally go to a restaurant. But there's also still a lot of happiness about people feeling good about being able to cook and almost feeling excited about being able to cook for their friends again because they can have people over in the future, right? So we are still seeing some indications that the cooking behavior that we saw an uptick on could persist for some people. Another piece is in the context of being helpful. We saw a lot of conversation around people sharing recipes, feeling like there's ways that they can kind of connect with one another through that. That's okay, BJ, thanks. So that was another piece that drove a lot of the conversation as well. You can see the person here sharing their grandmother's cinnamon roll recipe. The other piece that BJ kind of flipped to, which you can go back to now, is that we saw in the context of the conversations around cooking, this increase in discussion, particularly about people's appliances, right? So to BJ's point, because people are in their home, they have more control. They're thinking about all the things that they have at their disposal, how they can do this. My husband just got a digital thermometer for his meat and like baking, and he's like loving it. These things all of a sudden are much sharper focus for people. And we saw that coming through in the conversation, right? We have clients that are in this industry. They know that people are talking more about their kitchen appliances, but how they're talking about them and why they're talking about them, you can really see that kind of understanding come through when you look at some of these verbatim that are on the slide here.
Yeah, I got a new burr grinder. It's the best thing. I've been wanting to get it for 10 years, and now I finally have it.
Yes, very exciting. If you go to the next slide, another thing I mentioned is that we know that indulgence was a big part of the conversation and continues to be a part of the conversation in terms of drinking more alcohol or finding some CBD to like find a way to get through this. One thing that we've seen looking at social data is we're able to look pre-COVID, post-COVID, and then future, and then project to the future, right? So one thing we saw post-COVID is that conversation around whiskey really increased, but the conversation around whiskey linked to Netflix particularly increased, right? But as we look forward now with summer, there's more conversation around different drink ideas and cocktails and summer drinks. And again, going back to how do we create these celebratory experiences, as well as ready to drink, right? If I'm going to go over to my neighbor's house and have a backyard hangout in a socially distanced realm, I want to have something I can just take with me and drink and not have to, use their bottles or whatever that looks like. So those are the kinds of things we're seeing as the conversation evolves with alcohol, for example. And then just a couple more slides on this, and then we can get into some questions. But vacation and travel plans, this is actually data from our Marcoms tracker, but we saw that, a lot of people are definitely like want to get out of their house and are trying to really consider how they can do that. Most are not looking to travel internationally. Most are thinking about how can I get in my car and travel. But there's also a lot of people that are still like, I just don't even know if I have money, right? That's a very real perspective of people right now, trying to live through this and survive the reality of losing their jobs and not knowing what their future might hold and the stimulus checks going away. But for those that do look to travel, we're definitely seeing that the car is the dominant place that people are looking at for that experience. If you go to the next slide, this really comes to life when we looked at the social conversation. Particularly, we looked at the conversation around summer in the family life dashboard. So Vijay showed you the family life topic we had in there. And you can see that that conversation really came through in terms of how people with kids are considering their plans for the summer. They're changing a lot of them. You can see the word change or originally, like there's things that are coming through in terms of how people are trying to create something fun for their kids, but also thinking about safety and thinking about what that might look like to have a birthday party. Like there's a lot of things that are coming through. And you can see that come to life in some of these quotes as well. These are from our online community where people are talking about what they're planning to do and what that might look like. So again, these are ways that we can get more understanding of what people are doing and how they're looking at their summer plans. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to end really quickly before Vijay talks about the dashboard in more detail on some of the things that we're looking out for and that we're continuing to keep a close eye on as we look towards, I guess we're almost at summer. Are we at summer yet? Is it June 22nd?
We've got, yeah, like 12 days.
We're not there yet. So obviously reopenings, that's becoming a very real reality in many more states, right? I live in Los Angeles. Restaurants are opening this weekend. Just, okay, we'll see how that goes. So that's something we're keeping a close eye on. The protests, as Vijay mentioned, they're continuing to take place across the country. What are the impacts that's having on people in general and in the summer months? Health and wellness, as I mentioned, we did see there was an uptick in conversation around fitness, but then we also saw an uptick again of the indulgence piece because people again there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of like grieving going on right now, so there might be an uptick on that conversation. And how is that linking to anxiety and sleep, right? A lot of different nuances there to look at. And then finally, economic impact. Like I mentioned, a lot of us are lucky enough to have backyards and ability to take a car and drive places, but that is not everyone's reality. What does that economic impact have on people as they think about their summer and beyond, how they are going to take care of their kids, what does school look like? So really keeping an eye on that as well.
And
so hopefully that gave you,
wanted to add that this is what we know right now. I mean, obviously the next thing can happen that we don't see coming. Yeah. It changes everything.
Exactly. It seems to change every day. So I wanted to give you just a quick kind of look at how we're using social data to kind of bring the story to life. There's amazing amounts of depth we can go beyond this, but hopefully that helped to showcase some of the ways we're using it. So then I'm going to hand it back to Vijay. He's going to take you into the dashboard and really show you a bit more about how we came to some of those insights.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. Gonna make sure I'm in and share my screen again. All right, so we talked about a couple lenses to look at data, and I wanna touch on this and talk a little bit about these lenses now in our tool in the Synthesio platform. So I'm just gonna give it a second for it to load so you can see my screen. And I think that should be enough. So yeah, I'm in a dashboard here. I just wanted to show you this screen. This isn't actually what I'm going to show you. I wanted to highlight for you something that we're looking at within this dashboard, which is when we talk about a lifestyle conversation and when we're talking about trying to track and monitor and discuss them, what we're talking about are all of this constellation of topics, these ideas, and each one of them is has something behind it, like a set of topics or queries behind it. And I'm highlighting this for you to show you that nothing that we're looking at here is specific to specific to going into the summer with COVID as a context. Obviously, when we're thinking about what goes into a dashboard related to looking forward, we're aware of that context, but it's not something that is driving the structure. So the things behind cooking routines are about dinner time and what am I doing when I'm baking. The things that we're talking about when we're looking at health and wellness that we're looking for in the social conversation are about like, oh, I'm worried about exercise or gaining weight, and we're not looking at things specific to that. The other thing is, and I glossed over it in one of my slides, is that we are looking at a wide swath of data across all sorts of socials. I mentioned how people have a tendency to focus too much on Twitter. And here what we're actually looking at is across the whole social web, including the big four, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, but also going into forums and blogs and other types of sources where you can get some of that richness. So Manika mentioned those communities which are giving her additional insight. The conversations between people on Reddit, the conversations between people across even like review sites, things like that, actually offer a huge amount of value. And one of the things that actually Manika showed was an insight around the conversation around health and wellness. So we're running our signals trend detection over on top of these health and wellness topics. And these health and wellness topics are all being captured across various different things. And what we're doing is just trying to understand a little bit more. And here you can see the view that she saw where we had that word cloud. We're seeing lots of different things that people are bringing up around, when we're talking about health and wellness, people are talking about their kids. Well, what are they talking about? How are they talking about it? And what we've been doing, and someone asking I think someone asked in our questions, how much time went into finding insights and pulling insights out. What I'm doing here is essentially what we did is in large part, not exclusively. It's talking about looking at these word clouds, looking at these different insights, and looking at what came out of it, and then seeing what people are talking about when they're talking about, this is kids conversation, but we're seeing a lot of people talking about a various constellation of factors when kids come up in that summer conversation. So they're talking about keto, they're talking about summer vacation, ready for going on vacation, but all of this is coming up and they're thinking about what their kids are doing. And what we do when we're doing our research is go through this and try to see what are some of the differences, what are some of the similarities in the conversation. So Manika showed us some of those hashtags and those hashtags that came up with fitness. And here you can actually see the breakdown of which types of topics they tend to be associated with. So summer, interestingly, has an association with that self-medication topic, a higher association than most of these other conversations. And what we can do is actually say, well, what's that about? And click in again and do a little bit more research. Same thing going on with exercise here, or health, having a huge amount of conversation or relationship with stress and anxiety. So people are associating exercise with stress and anxiety. And so what we're trying to do is help you bubble up these additional elements, not just from the social, but also from, say, forums. So now when we look at the forums, we can see the types of conversations that are happening are just a little bit different. They're talking about summer, of course, but the people are talking about how things are going to be difficult. And this is where our kids are coming up as a stressor. rather than as something that might be about exercise. So the shape of the conversation is different from these different sources of media, and we can get an understanding of that really quickly by exploring it from all of these different angles and lenses. So I wanted to showcase that. And this is one of those ways that we would step away from looking at it from our brand perspective, because my concern as a brand, I'm ultimately trying to get an insight that'll help us make a decision. But usually what it comes from when we're looking at our customers and the public is that that's not how people are thinking. They're thinking about all of this constellation of problems that are affecting them, and how are they finding solutions? How are they getting to that certainty, that joy? So that's looking at things here in a very, very broad context, a lifestyle. What are some things that are going on? We can also look at things more narrowly. And we wanted to show this just kind of looking at some more recent data, looking at COVID specifically. So actually, let me go back. This is a whole dashboard looking around coronavirus, all mentions, as well as several different topics. And one of the things that we noticed this morning when we were looking at this dashboard is that there's a lot of conversation coming up around Canada, and there's something going on here. Canada announced, Canadian announced, so there's something going on here around Canada. And it's something that we might want to find out, like this is a conversation looking at basically global conversation in the US, or I'm not sorry, global conversation on coronavirus, excuse me. And we can, again, find out what's going on with Canada. Here we can see a huge amount of conversation with a huge amount of reach on Canada. And if I go click into those mentions, I see what are the things that are driving a lot of that conversation. Some of it is protest related, with respect to a lot of the protests are happening worldwide and not just in the US. So there's some response there. And then, of course, people talking about the reopening in the context of coronavirus. Airlines starting to get moving again. What is Justin Trudeau saying? What are they talking about? So the fact that Canada is talking about reopening and it's getting a lot of buzz is something that we wouldn't expect on a global dashboard when everyone's talking about it, but it's clearly affecting us over the last week, where it's a big part of the conversation. I'm realizing we have 10 minutes left, and I don't want to belabor a demo instead of questions. So I think I'm gonna pass it to Anna to just give us, if you found some questions that have come up, we can talk a little bit about answering those.
Yeah, thanks, Vijay, for that great demo. Yeah, and thank you to everyone who asked questions during the webinar. We have a great bunch here to sift through. So starting it off, we have a question. Can the tool identify key influencers and individuals in a conversation?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. Yes, we can totally give you a demo. Obviously today we wanted to focus in on what's coming up with the summer and talk about that. But yeah, absolutely. We have a whole influencers platform. You can flag them, monitor them, track them.
Awesome. The next question is, what are some things clients are asking right now based on their social data when looking towards the future?
Sure, I can talk to that. A lot, but I think I kind of alluded to some of the things that we're thinking about. A lot of our clients are asking about what behaviors do we expect to persist? What does that look like? And a big piece of that, we have a behavioral science team at Ipsos who we work with really closely, is to look at the social conversation from that perspective. What are some of the cues, the motivations, the emotions linked to some of those new behaviors or changing behaviors that we're seeing, and how can we use that as some of the clues to look at how they might persist? So I think broadly the big questions we're getting are around which behaviors could persist, how do we plan for that moving forward, and then also just in the communications front. That's been a big piece, especially early on with COVID, and then even now with the Black Lives Matter and seeing all of the brand communications coming out around that. We've definitely been using social data a lot to understand consumers' reactions in a very real-time way and help our clients optimize and evolve what that looks like.
And I
Great.
just want to add quickly to that. We also listed that whole pile of anxieties at the beginning of this. Those are directly from our customers. So those are types of questions they're asking, more about how do we operate. So less directly about the public and the consumer, and more about how do we operate. So those two kind of triangulate us towards answers and how to approach the data.
Great. Thanks, guys. So the next question, I think, Vijay, you touched on this briefly, but how much time was put into this undertaking with the social platform utilized, from setting up queries to pulling data?
Yeah, I can jump in on that.
Yeah,
I
can
think,
talk
oh,
okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
Since Mike did it, right, Vijay? Yeah, I think, one thing is like I said, we've been tracking the coronavirus conversation, since the beginning of the year. So, and like I said, Ipsos has so much research around the pandemic and everything else going on around that. So we were able to use a lot of that knowledge to pivot and create that lifestyle dashboard. The taxonomy is pretty in depth. And a lot of the inputs that went into that came from the knowledge of our analysts, talking through it with VJ, and also incorporating a lot of the research we're doing outside of social, quite frankly. So I know that's not necessarily a capability everyone has on their own. So that's definitely something that our team can help with. The other thing I'll say is I know VJ showed kind of how we use signals and how we use the dashboard to kind of signal, literally, what could be insights. And that's really the first step. But we do have to dig into that. We do have to contextualize that, and that requires the human. So I think the tool is only as good as the analysis time put against it, which I think is a really critical piece to getting more out of your social data.
Yeah,
Sorry.
all I was going to say was, in terms of what is possible, it's quite simple to set up a query and or sets of queries, and straightforward to do the analysis, since all of the capabilities are in the tool. But yeah, the value is, I like to think of signals, what I was showing you, as that notifications bar in your phone. Every morning you look in it, you decide whether you want to act, it's something important, or you want to just swipe it away. And how much you engage with the dashboard or with the data, and the way that you layer in those different lenses. I didn't talk about the ways you can filter multiple different lenses on top of each other. Obviously is some time, but as much as possible, the tool will help you automate the functional work, but the thinking work still, like Manika said, absolutely comes from a person being thoughtful about the way that they're looking at that.
Great, thanks, guys. And just to quickly answer a question myself, a video recording and the slides will be sent for the presentation after we finish up in a couple minutes. So the next question we have is, how do you determine the sentiment of social media content? It seems somewhat subjective, given that many posts likely express multiple emotions and perspectives.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that from the tool perspective, and I can talk about the
Yeah.
advanced data science?
Yeah. So I think you were talking about that emotion wheel. So I'll be brief. That actually wasn't directly from the Synthesio tool. But what we do have in the tool are several data science capabilities, including basic sentiment, positive, negative, and neutral, as well as some named entity recognition. What we can do then beyond that is, of course, as Ipsos, we have so much more power. So Manika, this is you. You can talk about that emotion wheel.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, we do quite often we'll take the data from the dashboard and apply advanced data science and analytics against it. So what you saw in some of the emotional frameworks is coming through from our data science teams and applying complex algorithms to really understand the nuanced verbatim and put the emotional framework together. So you're absolutely right. Verbatim on its own, if you look at the total sentiment, usually is misleading. So we are looking at it at the parsed word level when we're coding against that.
And in terms of how that affects your usage of a tool like Synthesio, our product development pipeline is basically driven by what is the type of analysis being done by advanced researchers, and how can we automate that into the tool. So as we go forward, emotion analysis and things like that will be layered into the product, but you know, it's still good to have a human eye and have different points of view, different ways to analyze it, because at the end of the day, tools aren't smart themselves. It's really how we use them that makes them smart.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, the last question that we have is, 1 minute. What makes Synthesio different from other social platforms?
That's a really broad question. Well, one of the things that makes it broad or makes it different is we do really take a business question approach to the data. Of course, you can just collect social data and visualize it, but a lot of our focus has always been on how are we answering a business question, or how are we answering questions about the public perspective. So that would be, I think, the overarching kind of umbrella under which everything else falls. The way we approach data science is this going to help answer questions, or is this just cool looking technology? Are we generating reports pages based on something that we think will be flashy, or is it because we've had customers consistently talk about doing some kind of brand intelligence, or these types of KPIs mattering? I think that would be the key difference. Manika, you've actually played with several tools in your past lives. So maybe you have anything to add there?
Sure, and I know we're at the end of the webinar, but I will just end by saying that we do currently use other tools as well if our client has to use that tool, but Synthesio is clearly our preferred tool. We acquired them for a reason, and really the biggest things that drove that is data sourcing, incredibly large reach there, incredibly long tail. As you saw, it goes much farther than just the core four. The global reach is really important to us from an Ipsos perspective. And I think the fact that we're able to bring the combination of a really strong tool with really amazing analysts, with the advanced data science that Ipsos can bring, and apply our frameworks and that rigor against social data is something that I think is truly unique. So hopefully that's a helpful way for us to end everything up.
Great, thanks, Annika. Yeah, so that is what we've got for you today. In terms of keeping posted, like I said, recording and slides will be shared via email. For Synthesio customers, we have our Injecting Quality and Confidence Across Your Social Data webinar coming up on June 30th. So definitely contact your point of contact at Synthesio for information about that. And then in July, we'll be doing a similar Ipsos and Synthesio webinar with Ipsos Mori. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to contact Vijay or Manika. So that's all we've got for you today. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.